Rain, mud, blackened trees, an invincible empire marches into a throat of shadows and does not return whole. In the Teutoburg Forest, 3 Roman legions were swallowed by something greater than swords, a limit. Some called it bad luck. I call it providence. If Rome was iron and order, their god drew an invisible line on the map of power. You are on the channel Faith and Power, stories the classrooms preferred to whisper. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and come with me to uncover why, in that barbarian reign, the Roman world learned to fear a god who would not bow to the eagles. Teutoburg, when God set limits to the Roman Empire. Stay until the end, because an ancient secret might change your present today. Rome was iron, order, and eternity. Dozens of peoples had been crushed beneath its sandals. Kings bowed. Cities rose in Roman style. Roads cut across continents. Senators proclaimed that nothing could halt the advance of the Golden Eagles. The legions, trained as human machines, were the living proof of imperial invincibility. No wall endured. No rival army survived the clash against that organized storm. At the heart of this power was pride. The conviction that Rome not only conquered lands but also civilized the world. Barbarian peoples were described as lawless, savages. Rome's mission was to shape them through iron and law. But there was one land that defied this destiny, Germania. It was no ordinary province. There were no wealthy cities to plunder, no easy kingdoms to subdue. There were only dark forests, treacherous swamps, and tribes who lived by the sword and by blood oath. To Rome, they were wild phantoms. To themselves, they were guardians of a freedom that could not be bought with gold. It was in this setting that Emperor Augustus decided to impose his will. Germania was to be conquered like so many other lands. Roads would be opened, fortresses razed, taxes collected. And to govern this hostile territory, Augustus chose Publius Quinctilius Varus, a trusted man, an experienced politician, but blinded by arrogance. Varus believed that decrees alone would make the Germans yield to the weight of Roman law. He demanded tribute, required submission, and thought he ruled by the divine right of the emperor. His vision was simple. The world was made to bend to the discipline of the legions. But among the Germans arose a name that would change history: Arminius. Born in the forest, raised among the tribes, Arminius knew the war chants of his ancestors. But Rome had taken him as a hostage when he was young, educated him as an ally, and returned him as an auxiliary commander. Trained as a Roman soldier, decorated as a knight, Arminius was considered a son of the imperial order. Yet Rome never saw the hidden flame within him. Arminius knew every trail, every valley, every tree of the German forests. He also knew the discipline of the legions, their strengths, and their secret weaknesses. It was as if Providence itself had shaped him into the key of Rome's downfall. Varus saw in Arminius a loyal ally. He trusted him as interpreter, as guide, as bridge to the forest peoples. But within that heart grew an unyielding conviction. Rome would not have the final word over his land. In the summer of the year 9 AD, 3 legions marched under Varus's command, about 20,000 men, accompanied by servants, porters, women, and children, an army in motion, confident, certain that nothing could stop it. The roads opened by engineers stretched into long columns of soldiers crossing the forest like rivers of iron. But Germania was not open ground. The trees closed in like living walls. The sky grew heavy. The ceaseless rain turned paths into mud. The weight of the armor multiplied. Exhaustion gnawed at the ranks. Still, the standards rose high, and Varus believed he was marching toward eternal order. Meanwhile, Arminius fed the plan. He smiled before Varus, but secretly gathered tribal chieftains, stirring them with the promise of freedom. Rival tribes, once at war with each other, now united under a single purpose: to break the chains of the empire. The legions did not know they were marching into a vast trap, an ambush born of their own Roman confidence. Blind pride kept Varus from seeing the signs, rumors of betrayal, strange movements, the disappearance of allies. To him, it all seemed nothing more than the noise of undisciplined barbarians. Rome trusted in the eternity of its destiny, but in that forest, destiny belonged to another. The first thunder was not of the sword, but of the sky. Rain poured harder, winds roared among the trees, the ground turned into an abyss. Every Roman step was sucked into the mud, every order sounded weaker than the storm's howl. The entire army seemed to march inside an invisible nightmare, and, in that silence, Arminius waited. Not as a servant of the empire, but as a son of the forest, as the voice of a people who refused to bend their knees. Rome did not yet know it, but it was about to face the limit no legion could cross, because in Teutoburg it would not only be spears that tore through the ranks, but the very hand of history writing in blood that even Rome had borders it would never cross. Arminius returned to Varus with the eyes of an ally and a tongue sharpened in loyalty. He spoke of a revolt among the Bructeri, of villages burned, of treacherous chieftains demanding exemplary punishment. It was the perfect bait. The governor, pressured by Augustus's urgency and his own pride, chose to march off the safe route. 3 legions, columns of wagons, families, animals, craftsmen, all dragged through the mud. The sky, heavy as a stone ceiling, announced a slow-coming deluge. The forest seemed to breathe, closing in. Arminius asked permission to gather his German auxiliaries and contain the rebels ahead. Varus agreed, satisfied. No one in camp noticed that within that courteous smile lay a blade wet with rain. The night before smelled of damp smoke and leather. Sentries swore they heard footsteps in the leaves, but the wind answered with ancient voices. On the map, the Teutoburg Passage looked like just a corridor between hills. In reality, it was a labyrinth of narrow trees, hidden swamps, and ridges that crushed ranks like pincers. Varus trusted discipline more than omens. He ordered part of the fortifications dismantled to save time, stretching the column to the horizon. The eagles glimmered in the torchlight as if bronze could scatter storms. A few veterans made the sign of their hands discreetly. Dawn brought slanted rain in blades. The road turned into a trail, the trail into a ditch. Wagons bogged down. Oxen bellowed, wheels splintered like brittle bones. Cohorts lost formation, forced to break into small blocks. With each turn, the column fractured further, like stretched glass. Drums fell silent when shields grew too heavy. Officers shouted, orders that died in the veil of water. The noise of the forest, drops, branches, mud, was a music that masked footsteps. The enemy walked on top of the sound of the rain, and no one noticed. Only a nameless unease grew. Then came the first whisper of death, a hail of short spears, cut through the air and sank into shields and throats. There was no trumpet. There was the crack of thunder and screams from every side, as if the forest itself opened its mouth. Warriors rose from the ravines painted, cloaked in soaked furs, with short bows, throwing axes, round shields. The first cohort wavered, trying to form a line, but the mud gripped ankles, and the trees blocked the Roman formation from rising. Varus ordered them to hold position, to lock shields and advance like a wall. Too late. The wall crumbled at the roots. The rear tried to turn, but the long column made any maneuver impossible. The forest forced Rome to fight as it had never trained. From a high point, Arminius raised his arm and dropped his fist, simple as plucking ripe fruit. His warriors answered with alternating volleys, vanishing behind trunks like ghosts with memory. He knew every Roman command, every centurion's gesture, every pause between orders. He struck in those dead spaces, cutting the breath of discipline. Trees, weakened beforehand, toppled across the road, splitting the column into smaller pieces, isolating officers, separating standards. Camouflaged pits swallowed men, horses, and wheels. Where Rome wanted width, the forest gave constriction. Where Rome wanted advance, the ground offered invisible resistance. It was the geometry of the limit, the mathematics of providence applied against pride. Some officers sought omens in the entrails of animals slaughtered in haste. The blood mixed with mud, revealing nothing but a turbid mirror. The augurs were far away. Here, Roman faith seemed to lose its language. Amid darts and screams, a veteran muttered that no god tolerates eternal arrogance. Another replied that Jupiter would punish the traitors. And still, the storm did not obey Jupiter. If there was a name that refused the empire's arithmetic, an invisible limit, as real as the weight of the shield. The enemy seemed to multiply, but it was the very landscape fighting, driving Rome into a funnel built by centuries of silence. The Aquilifer of the 17th fell with the eagle strapped to his chest. The standard struck the mud as if the heavens themselves had collapsed. A centurion rushed, tore the sacred emblem free, and lifted it above his head, trying to drag honor back to the surface. A short arrow pierced his neck. He knelt, still clutching the bronze. Soldiers clenched their teeth and formed a cocoon around the standard, but every step was a century, every yard a sacrifice. Beside them, a wagon overturned, and from beneath, its canvas a child cried. The centurion, voiceless now, stretched his hand, touched the eagle's wood, and fell. Varus gathered his officers under the rein, asking after Arminius. "Ahead, governor, leading auxiliaries," answered a tribune, not perceiving the venom in the words. They decided to send cavalry to scout the pass, but the horses slipped, and the trails vanished like serpents in the mire. Someone proposed building a fortified camp. There were no stakes, no ropes, no men left whole. They burned wagons to lighten the column. Black smoke rose, calling gods that did not come. A tribune swore that if they reached higher ground, order would be reborn. Varus nodded, promising rest at nightfall. Night did fall. Rest did not. The forest answered with multiple footsteps and a laughter without a mouth. The siege had begun. When night fell in full, Rome lit its torches, and the forest answered with eyes of embers scattered among the trunks. Varus ordered absolute silence, but silence returned with whispers. Centurions reorganized cohorts, buried the dead in haste, aligned shields into walls. Yet the wind scattered orders, and the rain erased trails. Arminius prowled their lines like an unseen wolf, measuring breaths. Chief after chief arrived under soaked cloaks, received instructions in the tongue of the forest, and departed in widening circles. On some nearby ridge, hollow drums marked an ancient rhythm, reminding them that time now marched against the empire. In the mud of their first makeshift camp, they raised crooked palisades from what remained of stakes and wagons. Blacksmiths improvised hooks to drag fallen trees. Medics cut tunics into bandages. Mules were slaughtered. In the distance, faint flashes tore the darkness, not as lightning, but as omens. A tribune swore he heard chants. Another said it was only crows. Varus walked beneath cloaks, touching shoulders, repeating that they would reach higher ground by dawn. No one slept. Water seeped inside their teeth. The standards wept metal. And above all hung a question no one knew how to pronounce. When morning clawed at the clouds, the first attempt at advance began. Engineers at the front, legionaries behind, shields raised, eyes narrowed. They advanced only a few stadia before the woods spat down a rain of javelins. The formation tried to close, but the stretched column made maneuver impossible. The trees tore through the geometry of discipline. Arminius tested the edges, biting and retreating, severing connections between centuries. The 18th cried out for help. The 19th did not hear. Messengers were lost. The mire swallowed signal flags. Varus ordered a retreat to firmer ground. He found only a sloping clearing that bled water on every side. There, they built a line of shields, fastened with ropes, stakes, and hope. The forest answered with boulders rolled from ridges and trunks hurled like living battering rams. A medic's tent turned into an altar of laments. Dismantled catapults became stretchers. An aquilifer, half-mad, swore to Mars a sacrifice if the eagle was saved. Thunder replied without translation. A Syrian slave recited verses of exile. A Roman rooster sought shelter beneath the standard, as if sensing an impossible dawn. And Rome, accustomed to controlling every sign, began to read the sky like an illiterate surrounded by foreign alphabets. Arminius did not strike to win in a single blow. He struck to exhaust, to fray nerves, to turn each order into a question. He cut down foragers, set wagons aflame, isolated centurions with war cries that seemed to come from under the earth. The Romans replied with short, desperate charges, advancing 2 steps to lose 3. A tribune suggested burying treasures and letters before they fell into enemy hands. Varus agreed, but his own writing trembled. On a tablet, he scribbled names of villages and promises to the emperor. The rain washed half away. What remained looked like a map of what God chooses to hide. On the second day, they tried to divert toward a ridge that promised firmer ground. The climb was a dagger. Cavalry slipped and men used hands to claw their way up the mud. Behind them, abandoned wagons smoked in quick fires. Germans appeared from the flanks, struck, and vanished. A crack of wood warned of new trees falling. The 17th, now reduced, carried its eagle like a sacred invalid, passing it from arm to arm, begging for time. Varus ordered them to form. A square around the standards. The square bent into a diamond, then into a spiral. In the spiral, fear. In the fear, a prayer without ritual, that a god without statues might intervene. In the command tent, wet even within, Varus stared into a tarnished metal mirror. He saw not the governor, but the defendant of a greater fate. A tribune proposed negotiating passage. Another spoke of burning a path through. Arminius, absent, was total presence. A captured scout swore that the Cherushi had vowed by rivers and ashes to annihilate the legions. Varus closed his eyes and thought of Augustus. He thought of senators who had mocked the Germans at banquets. He thought of the trail of Roman roads stretching far away, like stone serpents unable to bite the forest. On the third evening, the wind shifted. The rain thinned into a curtain, and the forest sharpened with knife-like clarity. Arminius gathered chiefs in a high clearing, raised his hand, and spoke of ancestors, oaths, children yet unborn. He promised to bury Roman pride beneath roots. He promised to return ancient names to the rivers. When he finished, a chorus of shields clashed in unison. He descended with measured steps, approaching Varus's lines but staying at bow's distance. He gestured with courtesy. The Roman messenger stepped forward. Arminius smiled like an obedient pupil. Then he delivered the final lesson. From a leather sack, he poured handfuls of iron rings, torn from the fingers of the Roman auxiliaries who had followed him. They fell to the ground like dark hail. The messenger paled. Varus at a distance understood. There was no rebellion ahead. There was a complete trap around them. Arminius raised one last ring between 2 fingers and flung it into the mud, as though sealing a pact with the earth itself. Then he turned his back, unhurried, while the entire forest rose in voices. The sound that came was not human. It was the limit opening its mouth, and it devoured Rome. The 4th day rose without dawn. The fog was so thick the standards looked like crooked shadows, and the soldiers walked like sleepwalkers inside a nightmare. Varus ordered a march, but the column was no longer an army. It was a starving mob. Covered in mud, guided more by instinct than discipline. Each legionary dragged not only his shield, but also the memory of what Rome had promised to be: invincible, eternal, radiant. Now eternity weighed like a chain. The sound of footsteps, mixed with muffled sobs, the groans of the wounded, the shouts of orders no one obeyed. The forest, after so much watching, seemed to learn the language of despair. Branches cracked, birds flew in bursts, and every sound was a herald of spears. With each bend, the column crumbled further. Tribunes tried to regroup cohorts, but the numbers no longer added up. Decades had become centuries. Centuries had dwindled to dozens. Arminius watched from the slopes, patient, like a hunter who wastes no weakened prey. His men struck in short waves, tore the edges, and pulled back. The entire forest was bow and arrow. Stones rolled from heights, spears rained from branches. Rome tried to form shields, but the mud prevented angles. Legionaries fell one after another, not in honorable combat, but swallowed by the invisible. One Aquilifer, half mad, raised the eagle and cried that Mars was still watching. At that instant, a downpour of javelins struck all around. The wood of the standard splintered, and the man fell across it, clutching the symbol as one holds a child. Another soldier rushed to save it, but a German warrior leapt from the trees and tore his life away. The eagle gleamed in the mud before vanishing. Beneath bodies, Rome was losing more than men. It was losing its soul. In the center, Varus still tried to impose authority. He ordered trenches dug to resist until the weather cleared. But the saturated earth returned water with every stroke. What opened was not trench but grave. The soldiers understood without words. Some wept. Others clenched their teeth. Varus recited speeches of courage, but his voice trembled. He knew the empire was broken. Twilight brought revelation. For the first time, Arminius descended to the edge of the clearing, visible. He wore not Roman armor, but barbarian tunic, round shield, and short spear. His eyes shone with the certainty of those who fight for their home. From afar, he shouted in Latin, mocking, "Varus, give me back the freedom that was never yours." The phrase echoed like a sentence. The soldiers lowered their heads. Night fell with a crash. The Roman torches were drowned by rain, and darkness ruled. The final assault began not with trumpets, but with drums beaten in unison. From every direction, warriors erupted. There was no column anymore, no discipline. It was slaughter. The forest itself seemed to spit men, screams, blades. Legionaries cried the names of their gods, begged the heavens for aid. But the heavens answered only with thunder. Varus, surrounded, understood. If captured, he would be dragged alive by the tribes, paraded as a trophy. He decided that honor lay in his own end. Alongside his officers, he drew his sword and, in a final act, fell upon the blade. Others followed, choosing voluntary death over humiliation. Thus, leadership fell before the last soldier. When the timid sun rose, the scene was a sea of corpses. 3 entire legions lay scattered, broken, swallowed by mud. The standards had vanished, the screams had ceased. Only the forest sang, satisfied. Arminius walked among the remains, raised a broken Roman shield, and planted it in the dirt as a sign that even Rome bled. The empire, until then without limits, had just met a frontier. Not a river, not a wall, but the invisible hand of history. Rome would weep for decades, and Augustus, upon hearing the news, would wander his palace murmuring, "Varus, give me back my legions." But Varus would not return. None of the 20,000 would return. Teutoburg was an open wound, an eternal scar, a reminder that even eagles must learn to fall. In that twilight, Rome ceased to be invincible. and God, silent, carved into the mud of Germania, the limit no human sword could erase. The field of Teutoburg was no longer a field. It was an open cemetery, an altar without priests, a stage where the mud itself had become the scribe. Among slanted trees, the wind carried the stench of blood, iron, and extinguished fire. Germanic. Warriors moved among the wreckage, gathering weapons, smashing shields, seizing trophies. Some cut off heads to raise on spears, others collected rings, belts, fragments of glory. To them, it was sacred victory. To Rome, it was the eternal night of 3 legions. Arminius walked slowly, like a priest after sacrifice. His gaze was not only that of a warrior, it was the gaze of one who read the scene as scripture. Every fallen body was a sign that the empire was not infinite. Rome had promised eternity, but in the mud, the opposite was written. Eternity belongs to another. Arminius knew Augustus would hear the rumor, that senators would weep, that generals would scream for vengeance. But nothing could change the fact. A boundary had been drawn. In the capital, the news cut across seas and roads like a dagger. Augustus, lord of the world, fell into despair. He repeated, "Varus, give me back my legions." He was not only asking for men, but for the illusion of invincibility. Rome launched new campaigns, but it never rebuilt its broken confidence. Germania never became a province. The Rhine remained the frontier. The dream of expansion to the Elbe died in the mud of Teutoburg. Roman historians recorded the disaster with restrained pain. Tacitus spoke of governors' arrogance. Cassius Dio described the terror of survivors. Suetonius remembered Augustus's lament. Yet behind the official lines echoed something deeper. This was not merely military defeat. It was the revelation that Rome was not master of destiny. For the first time, the empire recognized the existence of an invisible wall, stronger than legions. And here, faith enters the scene. For the Bible has always spoken of empires that exalt themselves to the heavens and then fall like dust. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, learned in exile to fear the God who casts down and raises kingdoms. Pharaoh, who thought himself eternal, was conquered by an opened sea. Rome, in that shadowed forest, learned the same lesson. Human glory has an expiration date. The mightiest dominion still meets the hand that writes boundaries. Many soldiers, in their final breaths, cried out to gods who gave no answer. But perhaps, without knowing it, their groans rose to the unknown God who was already watching history. For the defeat of Rome opened the way, centuries later, for Christianity not to be swallowed whole by the imperial machine before it could mature. If Rome had subdued all Germania, perhaps the cross would have become nothing more than a palace ornament. But God willed the cross to be more than adornment. He willed it to be blood, testimony, unbreakable faith. Teutoburg, then, was not only a military catastrophe. It was part of the great invisible script, a boundary reminding the empire, you are not eternal, a frontier preparing the heart of Europe to receive in due time the seed of the gospel. The forest that defeated the eagles would one day hear monks chanting psalms, kings raising cathedrals, peoples crying out to Christ, whom no Caesar could imprison. The echo of that reign, of those screams, still crosses the centuries. Every empire that deems itself eternal should hear Teutoburg. Every nation that considers itself invincible should remember the mud that devoured the legions. And every human heart, swollen with pride, should look at this scar of history and understand there are limits only God sets. Today, as the world raises new empires, political, economic, technological, the question returns. Where will the Teutoburg of our time be? Where will Providence once again write that no human power lasts forever? The forest may be digital, the legion may be of algorithms, but the lesson remains. Pride falls. Human glory collapses. The name above all names endures. And you, who have walked with me until now, Do you hear this echo? Between rain and silence, the voice that said to Rome, "Enough," also speaks to us. It reminds us that there is a king greater than Caesar's, a throne higher than empires, an eternity that does not depend on armies. This is faith and power. If this story has touched you, subscribe, share, comment. Not because the algorithm demands it, but because every heart that hears these truths becomes part of the same divine line. Teutoburg was not only the end of legions, it was the beginning of an eternal reminder. The limits of man are the stage where God writes his glory. The forest of Teutoburg still stands. New trees have risen where soldiers once fell, and birds sing over roots that drank Roman blood. Whoever walks those trails today finds silence, but it is not emptiness. It is a silence heavy with memory, as if every leaf still repeated the muffled cries of men who believed themselves eternal. The earth does not forget, history does not forget, and God never forgets. Rome, mistress of the world, was forced to admit that its march had an end. Augustus, the emperor who thought himself chosen by the heavens, spent nights crying out for the return of legions that would never come back. His anguish was not only for soldiers, it was for the collapse of the illusion of eternity. The defeat showed that even the greatest eagles can be torn from the sky and hurled into the mud. But above the human drama, there was a greater script. That massacre was not merely a barbarian ambush, not merely strategic calculation. It was a lesson written in iron and mud. The limits of man are established by the finger of God. Neither the discipline of the legions, nor the grandeur of the Senate, nor the decrees of Augustus mattered. When the Lord of history chooses to say, "Enough," no sword can cross the line. And it was no coincidence. Rome needed to learn its fragility, for only fragile empires can receive the message of the cross. Christianity was not born in golden thrones, but in stables and martyrdoms. Had Rome become utterly absolute, perhaps the seed of the gospel would have been suffocated by imperial arrogance. Instead, Rome was wounded, Rome was humbled, Rome was prepared. The same empire that lost 3 legions in Teutoburg, centuries later, would kneel before Christ. This is the beauty of the divine paradox. From mud springs light, from limit comes revelation, from defeat emerges the future. The forest that devoured the legions would, generations later, become soil for monasteries, cathedrals, and communities of faith. The echo of the barbarians who cried against Rome was transformed into chants exalting the Lamb. Where Rome found an end, God was writing a beginning. And us? What do we learn before this ancient stage? We are tempted to believe our modern empires, technology, politics, finance, science are unshakable. But the lesson of Teutoburg resounds. No human empire endures forever. Glory that refuses to bow before the eternal falls, sooner or later. The mud still waits for the proud. Therefore, when we contemplate the fall of Rome in that forest, we do not see only the past. We see warning. We see prophecy. We see God reminding in a firm voice that He alone is Lord of history. You have been with faith and power. If this truth has set fire to your mind, subscribe, share, leave your comment. Not to feed numbers, but to spread memory and faith. For history is not forgotten ruin. It is trumpet. It is sign. It is the whisper of the infinite, calling you to recognize the only king who will never know defeat.